Welcome to the 11 parts of the story for journalism. These are the 11 things that you're going to learn that are different, a little bit similar than your language arts stories. Let's get started. You'll want to be on page 25 in your VM, and you'll fill in the 11 boxes with the words and leave some room for the definitions, but also pay attention to the examples that I give you. Let's start with headline. You should know a headline. It's always above the story. It's the title of the story, and it always sits above the story, and it's a lot larger. For example, the Legally Blind Kayaker story, it was bolder. It was called The Legally Blind Kayaker Going Down Mississippi Solo. That's the headline. There's always one per story. The next thing I want to point out is the lead. The lead is just a fancy word for the introduction of the story, and it's always written to pull the reader in. You probably have heard it called the hook in your language arts class. The lead in the kayaker story was Doug Pace had wanted some adventure in his life. That's it. That's the lead. Not by Jack Hittinger, not May 19th, not Bemidji, just this part. Doug Pace had wanted some adventure in his life. To get information for your interviews, we always pull from sources. Now, in language arts, your sources are typically books and things in print, which ours can be too. But since we are the ones putting things into print, we get our information from people. But we can also pull information from websites and books as well. For example, in the kayaker story, a lot of people often circle by Jack Hittinger as the source. That is not the source. That's the author of the story. The source of the story was Doug Pace. He's the one we got information from. Jack interviewed Doug, and Doug is the stories we told. Attribution is the next term. Attribution is a big word for a very small thing. This is how the reporter tells the reader where the information comes from, and it is always attached to quotes, and it is how we cite sources in stories. For example, in the quote, I'd always wanted to do something big, the North Bay, Ontario native said. I've circled the North Bay, Ontario native said. That's the attribution. Notice that the word said is last. The word said is always next to the attribution. Sometimes it's a person's name, sometimes it's a pronoun. For example, later in the story, he said. We know that the only person in the story was quoted was Mr. Pace, and he said this quote. So we're not always going to refer to Pace or Mr. Pace or Doug Pace. Sometimes we'll refer to him as he. He said is the attribution, and it's right next to a quote. So again, it's things like native said, North Bay, Ontario native said. It could say Doug Pace said. It's he said. So attributions are just a big scary word for something small. A direct quote. Direct quotes use quotation marks, and it's exactly what the person said. For example, in a story, you're going to notice that I'd always wanted to do something big. This is a direct quote because in red circled are quotation marks. All right? These words came out of Doug Pace's mouth. This is exactly what he said. Also, down here, I've got all the maps and have studied them pretty extensively, he said. Northern Minnesota is going to be pretty rough because it's a bit narrower. Again, this is a direct quote. He said this exactly. Quotation marks are surrounding this quote. That's a direct quote. Another type of quote you're going to find in a story is called an indirect quote. This is a quote that does not have any quotation marks. It's kind of a summary of what a person said, or sometimes you take a short answer from an interview and turn it into an indirect quote. For example, you still have an attribution. There's the attribution in red. It is he says. You always look for the attribution. Then you look around to see if there's any quotation marks. There are no quotation marks. This is an indirect quote. He says it's important to let both his blind peers and the general public know that his condition isn't a deterrent. So a good way to mix up your writing is to have a combination of both direct quotes and indirect quotes. A fact. You should know this. It's information in a story that's happened or it can be proven. There's plenty of facts in a story. For example, Pace was diagnosed with retinitis pigmentosa in 2000 isn't totally blind. He has 5 degrees of central vision. That's a fact. It can be proven. And below that, the journey was going to be 1,500 miles. That is something that can be measured and proven. You definitely want to have a lot of facts in your stories. But you also can include opinion. Now, opinions are only in quotes and are responses only from your sources that are beliefs, ideas, feelings, things like that. They never come from the writer. They only come from the sources. For example, we've got from Mr. Pace, I also want to encourage my peers to let them know that they can deal with it in a constructive way. What are you going to do? Sit around the couch all day and mope? No, you can do great things with your life. See, that's in a direct quote. It's quotations. He said it. It's an opinion. It's not from the writer. First person sometimes appears in journalism writing. First person is when the speaker addresses themselves, like I, me, we, us, our, ours, mine, words like that. First person's only found in direct quotes. If there are no quotation marks around it, there should not be any first person. So direct quotes, first person. No quotation marks, no first person. For example, here are two direct quotes where Pace is talking and I is in there. I read about a guy, Buck Nelson, who did it in a canoe. Or I also want to encourage my peers. See, I is okay because Pace is talking about himself and it's surrounded by a direct quote, so a quotation mark. Third person is everywhere else in the story. So for example, it addresses everyone but the speaker. He, she, them, they, him, her, his, theirs, and also the source's first name and last name. Most of your story will be written this way. Look at all the different third-person pronouns and names I've circled. He and his and him and Pace. These sentences are written in third person. That means the writer does not include him or herself in the story at all. The final thing you need to make note is that journalism uses short paragraphs. In language arts, your paragraphs are typically 5 sentences or more. In journalism, we just cannot do that because of the formatting. Your sentences are going to be 1, 2, or 3 sentences long. Check out those indents. The first indent, that's only 1 sentence. It is okay to have a 1-sentence quote. Check out the second indent. That's just 2 sentences. Check out the next indent. That looks like it's about 2 sentences as well. Since we run our stories in columns, we want to use short paragraphs. Otherwise, it looks like it's too much to read. Make sure you get these notes down. These are the 11 parts of the story.